Today, I speak with scientists at the absolute bleeding edge of research into this, frankly, much misunderstood illness. I speak with Dr. Cara Altimus, who leads the initiative BD2, Breakthrough Discoveries for Thriving with Bipolar Disorder at the Milken Institute, and her colleagues, Dr. Mark Frye, a psychiatrist at the Mayo Clinic, and Dr. Kate Burdick, who is based at the Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School in Boston. We go through some of the myths and emerging truths of bipolar. We talk about the frequent comorbidity of anxiety in people with bipolar, as well as the comorbidity of ADHD. And the truth is, there is so much more to learn. And so the doctors here will talk a little bit about how perhaps you, if you manage bipolar, can get involved. I want to also mention that bipolar people are often coded for leadership. We may just want to live normal, healthy lives like everyone else, but we are also able to be great leaders at work. Here's my conversation with the BD2 team. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and also to people at my audience. I'd love to start just with a brief introduction of who you are and the work that you do. And Mark, you popped into my screen, so why don't we start with you?
All right. Hi, Morra. I'm Mark Frye, and I'm a psychiatrist at Mayo Clinic. Have been working with individuals living with bipolar disorder, for close to 25 years now. It is an area of interest that is near and dear to my heart. Part of my role with this group today is representing the integrated network of BD2. I'm one of the scientific co-directors.
Great. Thank you. Kate, how about you?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Burdick, and I am based at the Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School in Boston, where I am mostly focused on doing research. And the research that I work on over the past 30 years or so has been really surrounding the heterogeneous outcomes. So different outcomes that we see in people who live with bipolar disorder. Really trying to understand why some people thrive with this diagnosis and other people have such a hard time and struggle with disability and so on. And again, as Mark introduced, I am the other co-director of the integrated network for BD2.
Great. Thank you. Cara?
Thank you for having us. I am the managing director of BD2 and have been leading the whole initiative over the last 3 years or so as we've put together our different programs that are trying to bring together research and clinical practice so that we are able to both change our foundational knowledge and in real time help people have improved outcomes with bipolar disorder. In addition to this role, I also sit inside the Milken Institute and work across our science philanthropy funding programs.
Great. Thank you. Let's start with the most basic question, which I think probably most people in my audience know, but just in case there's any newbies out there, how do we define bipolar disorder? Mark, why don't you take that?
Morra, I will go ahead and give you that definition from a clinical perspective. I think what's important to recognize here is how highly variable the presentation can be amongst different people and even with one person over the course of their lifespan. But bipolar clinically refers to the mood swings of mania or hypomania and depression. For some of the audience, they may recognize a more historical term referred to as manic depressive illness. But in short, clinically, these are severe mood swings. It's important to emphasize this is not having a bad day or being really exhilarated with good news. These are syndromes or illnesses that have mood symptoms, sometimes psychotic symptoms, cognitive impairment, anxiety, and we can see a whole host of different symptoms in each of these severe mood swings. I think part of the challenge of those individuals living with bipolar disorder is that there's a lot of other, what we call comorbidities, that can be associated with that. So other conditions such as addiction or attention deficit disorder, but additional medical illnesses we often see walking hand in hand with bipolar disorder, such as diabetes, being overweight or obese, having difficulties with cardiac or cardiometabolic conditions. So it's severe mood swings, but it has a substantial amount of additional medical concerns that make it challenging to diagnose and challenging to stabilize.
Is there a difference between bipolar disorder with psychosis and without? Is that still a thing?
So all of the diagnostic subtypes, which you're referencing, and one of them is the presence or absence of psychosis. We do see differences in how they may respond to potential types of treatments. We do see differences in how the illness unfolds over time. I think the important piece to really add to this question, which is why this initiative is so important, none of these categories have a true understanding in the biological basis of those symptoms, and we need to better understand that to be better at the diagnosis and to provide better treatments ultimately.
What's the difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2?
So that's an important distinction as well. Bipolar 1 really references a history of mania. And I think when most people think about mania, they think about kind of periods of exhilaration and elevated euphoric mood, sometimes with psychosis, not necessarily, oftentimes needing hospitalization, oftentimes associated with a significant cognitive change, whether it's racing thoughts, distracted thoughts, and impulsivity. I think the important piece to know about mania or bipolar 1 is while it can for some be very euphoric, it's important to emphasize that we can see a mixed pattern where there are manic symptoms and depressive symptoms put together. And that is not a pleasant experience. It's a frightening experience and one that is more difficult to treat. Bipolar 2 is still focused on the mood elevation, but in this case, it is not as significantly elevated. So bipolar 1, we refer to as mania. Bipolar 2, we refer to as hypomania, meaning the elevation is there, but it's not as striking. It is not associated with psychosis or hospitalization, but it is in fact a mood elevation. Important to identify that because that really starts to distinguish bipolar disorder from our other major mood disorder, which we call major depressive disorder.
This is going to sound like a dumb question, but do you have to have the major depressive piece to be bipolar?
That's an important question because it really highlights the challenges of how we make the diagnosis. For many individuals living with bipolar disorder, it is clear when you look at their course of illness, how it unfolds over time, that there can be one or even multiple episodes of depression before that hallmark defining manic or hypomanic episode, which in essence changes the illness from major depressive disorder to bipolar disorder. However, we can also see, in particular, when the episode is a first episode, is everything's just fine. And then all of a sudden, a rapid emergence of manic symptoms. So in that case, the depression wasn't the first set of symptoms. But we know for bipolar 1, or when we see that mania, that we will soon thereafter likely see a post-manic depression, which then makes the diagnosis of bipolar type 1.
Got it. One of the things that was tricky to me was that, in the movies, we see people who go up and then they go down, and it's quick. You know what I mean? But in real life, the up and downs can take years, right? Or they can be periodic or episodic. It's not like you're always cycling, right?
You're bringing up some really important points that are critical to really understand how best to think about treatment. So there are individuals that will cycle most of their life and are always with symptoms. I think that really underscores kind of the virulence of the illness or how ineffective our treatments are. But that switch process, so going from mania to depression, often is really quite abrupt. Going from depression to mania is often quite abrupt. And that's actually a really important, what I would call diagnostic difference or feature, because what you're highlighting is when we think about episodes of major depression, individuals who don't have bipolar disorder, those episodes emerge slowly, they progress slowly, they last longer. By and large, episodes of depression in bipolar disorder are shorter. They're more frequent. So even characterizing the progression of the depression helps us better understand, is this a bipolar type of illness, or is this more slow, progressive, single or recurrent episodes of depression?
Interesting. Does that hold for bipolar 2 as well?
It does. What we really understand about bipolar 2 is at the end of the day, it is a depressive predominant illness. And that really starts to change the way we think about treatments. If it is mania, we will always work with anti-manic or what we call mood stabilizing treatments. With the depressive phase of bipolar type 2, because of its pervasiveness and its predominance in the overall illness, we'll think about other treatments in times also including conventional antidepressants.
Got it. Thank you. Heterogeneity was a word that you mentioned up top, and I think you're already showing the incredible heterogeneity of how this disease shows up. I want to throw it out to any of you. What is our baseline of what we sort of know now about the role of genetics and bipolar? And we can focus on bipolar 1, 2, or both. I know your study is primarily right now focused on bipolar 1, but what do we know about the role of genetics and bipolar?
Kate, do you want to get started and I'll jump in?
Sure. I'm happy to. It's a good question. There has been progress in the field of understanding the genetics that underlie bipolar disorder. But what we've learned really over the last couple of decades is that this is an illness that is highly heritable, which means genetics plays a major role. It hangs in families, so it is inherited. If you have first-degree relatives with it, you have a tenfold increased chance of a diagnosis yourself. So we know that genetics is important. I think when the field started looking for genes, looking and trying to discover genes that were associated with the illness, there was the hope that there would be a bipolar gene. This is no longer even a possibility in our understanding of the way the genetics contribute to the illness. It's what we call a highly polygenic disorder, which means that variations in many different genes contribute to a risk for diagnosis. Each of those genes contributes a tiny little bit of risk. So we really think that you have to have a multitude of these risk factors across the genome that add together to hit the threshold of actually getting this diagnosis. And what happens there is that it becomes difficult to discover new genes because they're so tiny. The effect is so tiny that you need hundreds of thousands of people with the illness to be sequenced in order to find any new genes that contribute to the disease. The other thing that I'll comment on, which I think is an important component of this, is we don't really know what many of these genes do and how they act to increase risk for the disease. It's, small, tiny changes at the level of the genome that have tiny effects end up doing something in people's brains that really contribute to why they are at more vulnerable to this kind of diagnosis. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of what we call risk alleles that we really don't know what they're doing biologically. And so at the moment, we're unable to use this information in any way that contributes directly to treatment.
So if I might,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, tell me if you want to take it a different direction, Morra. I was going to share what are we doing about that, and how is BD squared jumping in, seeing that this is a science problem that is simply underfunded, and that we can bring more to play there. As we were doing our initial work to develop the planning for BD squared, one of the things that was showing up was actually just how much less work had been done on the genetics of bipolar than the genetics of many other illnesses that we do have a greater genetic understanding of, and are starting to be able to use that information to help individuals today. And so we took it upon ourselves to try to understand what would it take to increase our understanding of the genetic architecture of bipolar based on everything that Kate shared. We know that it's highly heritable. We know that there are going to need to be hundreds of thousands of people that will need to participate in that research. And we know that that's expensive research to do, but has paid dividends in areas like Parkinson's, for example. And so we scanned the whole globe and said, who are the samples? What does it look like for the samples that have been sequenced, and what has that yielded in genetic information, and what's missing? And we put a call out to the world and said, we want to promote more genetic sequencing. The sequencing that had been done to date at that point was a very predominantly European sample. And it was so European that we were hearing from research teams that they were having to exclude non-European samples from the analysis. And so we asked for groups to join us in identifying cohorts and sequencing a global diversity of individuals, and have in the time since we launched in 2022, we have doubled the number of individuals sequenced for bipolar disorder. That has been a broad diversification of geographies around the globe. And I can't spill the beans all the way, but to say that we know that there are new genes that are in the track of publication at the moment, that will be a massive leap forward and understanding the genetic architecture.
Let's take this moment, actually, because I think I saw on your website that you aim to recruit 4,000 people with bipolar 1, and you're collecting brain tissue samples. Do living people give brain tissue samples?
So let's take one step back, and I'll dive in. So Mark, in his comments at the top, just explaining what is bipolar and what is this massive the complexity of heterogeneity, both in symptoms and the temporal nature of bipolar. We started off in this effort to say, what do we need to do from a research standpoint? And Mark shared, we know that it's a highly heterogeneous population. We have very low biological understanding of bipolar. Kate shared some of that in her comments as well around the genetics. And some of the other things that we found, our research actually showed that the federal funding for bipolar has been decreasing over the last 10 years. Additionally, we've looked most recently, and that trend has continued to be published later this summer. So massive underfunding. And then kind of due to the nature of how funding has lined up to date prior to BD Squared starting, very, very siloed research. And so we came together with philanthropies and said, how do we put together a research agenda that massively increases what we know and can learn about bipolar? How do we leverage that research to improve lives now? And how do we create an organization that is solely focused on ensuring that all people with bipolar disorder thrive? That led to an agenda with 4 discrete initiatives. One of those initiatives is to elucidate and build out understanding of the biological pathways with a hypothesis that there are multiple. One of those is to understand differences in people's brains, those people living with bipolar disorder. So that's the one that you're referencing. The third one is around how do we build out genetic understanding. So I talked about that a moment ago. And the last one is this integrated network of bringing together of 4,000 people living with bipolar, all from all different geographies, to understand their disease trajectory, how they respond to medications, and how do we reinvest into their care so that we can improve care for all. So that brain piece that you were asking about is separate from, it's research wise, separate from the integrated network, the 4,000 person cohort. That is coming from brain banks that are around the country and are from people who are lost their lives, but their brains were donated. And we learned in our process of research that those brains were effectively they were being preserved for investment some point down the line. And we said, enough is enough. We will bring the investment and we will learn from those brains today.
Wow.
Because it's not serving us to have them sitting in a freezer. It does not serve the population of people living with bipolar to have them in a freezer. So let's learn now. So that's what that is. So people are not donating their brains or brain tissue in life.
This image and knowing people who live with bipolar, they'd probably be willing to do this. Of people coming and being like, sample my brain tissue.
But we are imaging people's brains in the cohort to see if there are differences or changes over time. But no samples.
Thank you for indulging me.
Morra, if I could quickly give you what the clinical impact is of a decreasing research funding agenda, I think this really underscores why BD Squared is so critical. And let me play the devil's advocate a little bit. Why might there be less funding for bipolar disorder? It's a complex illness, and every other major mental illness we have, you are either sick or you're well. And so if you think about clinical trials, people come in when they're sick, and then a positive outcome measure would be achieving wellness. The challenge here is if we're studying the depressive phase of illness, getting non-depressed or better at the expense of getting manic is not a good outcome. If we're developing mania trials and becoming non-manic at the expense of getting depressed, that's not a good outcome. So there's a complexity of the illness, not to mention all the heterogeneity, which we talked about before, that I think makes it just very challenging. But at the end of the day, that research funding has been decreasing. And as research goes down, clinical understanding of the illness is not achieved. Better drug development or new treatment options is not achieved. We lose life expectancy. So there is this kind of aftermath of these research funding changes that dramatically negatively impact how we can try to better understand the illness to better treat it. So BD Squared is really occupying a critical space with a large mandate to figure out how best to thrive.
I'm so glad. And I honestly think also that one of the things with bipolar that, I mean, I guess it is rare compared to other mental illnesses, certainly like anxiety and depression, but it's considered a disease of despair. It is highly stigmatized, and I think probably affected by stereotype and stigma in a way that other diseases may not seem to be. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
I can certainly chime in. I'd like to hear Kate and Cara's thoughts. I agree. There is a stigma to this illness that prevents people from seeking care, provides challenges to really optimize treatments and achieve wellness and a thriving status. You know, I had teachers in my early graduate days that really referenced the era where no one talked about cancer. And it was as stigmatized, I think, as you're now referencing with the question, here we are in 2025. And I think the way that stigma was really busted with cancer was scientific research, scientifically driven clinical trials, and a large advocacy group to really continue to show the data, demystify aspects of the illness, and in doing so, reduce the stigma of the illness
And give hope. You can't reduce stigma if you have nothing to replace the despair with.
Completely agree.
You know.
So that's where we need to be. We need to take the roadmap of cancer and do that for bipolar disorder. And I think that will be one way to reduce stigma. I think BD squared is a beacon of hope in that regard.
Kate or Cara, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I would add a little bit to the stigma comment just to point to a couple different kinds of stigma and the way that this can show up for bipolar disorder even more than some of the other psychiatric illnesses. And the first is self-stigma. When people receive a diagnosis, there's this feeling that there's something wrong with me. And interestingly enough, among people with bipolar disorder, many of them consider this to be both a curse and a blessing, right? So it's very difficult for them to distinguish themselves from the disease. And I think typically what you do see with many people who have this diagnosis, over time, they learn to embrace it and accept it. But in the beginning of the illness, it really truly is someone telling you something's wrong with you and you're going to need to take this medication to fix that for the rest of your life. And it's part of who you are. I think that's a really important thing that we need to think about and better understand for the people who are living with the disease. But beyond that, you think about the stigma that's coming more from the public domain, where what we see in the news are people who are acutely manic, who are behaving in a way that is disturbing in public, whether they're running around naked or they're doing something that is very uncharacteristic of them. It can look very scary to people who don't know and understand what the illness really is.
It can be. I mean, I think we just need to say right out, it can be dangerous. It can be scary. It puts people's lives. It can be that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's important. There are an enormous number of risk factors for a person who is acutely manic and not being treated and, often end up either arrested by the police or sort of brought to the hospital in an ambulance because of those kinds of behaviors. And so there's a lot of danger that's associated with that. What is sort of interesting about the illness around this, though, is that the reason people see this as something that they embrace and really consider part of who they are is because there are also what we think of as somewhat positive things that come along with the up periods. Acute mania, when there's, kind of disorganization and psychotic features, is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about more of the other aspects of the disease that contribute to things like increased productivity. So increased creativity. Some of the things that you see, again, in the news where there's a stigma where bipolar people are more creative. They are, and you see it again in the media. There are people who are coming out and saying, I have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. which actually I think is helping the stigma in a lot of ways. And I think the last thing I would note, being a person in the research field, and always trying to figure out how do we fund the work that we're doing. Philanthropy is even difficult to get in this area because of the stigma. I'll give you just a very brief anecdote where I was sitting on a panel just talking about mental wellness, really more broadly, to a community of people who had been donors in some way to the hospital where I work. And after the panel, someone came up to me and said that he had considered not attending this particular panel because he knew that it would mean to the other people in the audience that either he or someone he loves must have a psychiatric disease. And that was only 5 years ago. So we're still in a place where this is not like cancer is now. It's still the sort of whispering, I think, in the background that people are still hiding these types of things. And so there's a lot of work still to be done in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I work with and study leaders who have serious mental illness or are neurodivergent. I mean, the thing that I think is really interesting about bipolar is that in the neurodivergence field, it's sort of becoming an identity first piece of people who identify, as I do, as I'm bipolar, not I'm a person living with bipolar disorder. I am bipolar, and it is I am neurodivergent. It is a huge piece of who I am. And I want to come back to what you're learning about people who thrive with it, that there are tremendous gifts that come with it, as well as tremendous costs. It's one of those things that is just, like you said, Mark, it's just so complex to unpack. It's not simple. But it's profound for people who live with it. And we just want people to understand us,
Absolutely. If I might add one more piece of the stigma equation that we see really show up in the work that we're doing, trying to bring funders and clinicians and people with bipolar together. And that's the stigma around actually accessing and receiving care and help with bipolar. And that I think back to one of the earliest conversations I had with a potential donor. We were outlining the plan for what we were going to do in BD squared. And he said to me, he was like, "But you're not looking to take away my bipolar, are you?" And I I paused to try to like, am I going to get more information here? Because we outlined a pretty scientific learn more, help more agenda, and he was like, I like a lot of parts of who I am, and I consider that core to who I am. And when I go to see a clinician, they're trying to take all of that away from me. And I think a lot of what we've heard, if I pull together pieces that Mark has shared and Kate has shared, there's a lot of harm that can come, but it is central to a lot of people's identity. And there are components like creativity that people consider who they are. And and that then affects how we need to be thinking about what science are we doing? How are we including people with bipolar in our planning and our outcomes in the whole work and at every level? And so that we're making sure that we're not over medicalizing or over solving from the outside, but actually building with and as participant in. And if we take it all the way back to the cancer um, analogy, I can remember I lost a father to cancer more than 20 years ago. And as we were in the final days of that, um, we had a lot of friends and family actually say, you shouldn't bother with chemotherapy. It's worse. You should just manage through the end without. And that to me strikes me, and I feel like that's not said as often anymore. There's a lot more hope in that space.
Yeah.
But in bipolar, you see a lot of kind of similar sentiment. And we need to get beyond that. We need to actually create trajectories and care and understanding that are built with people for people to manage bipolar the way they want it to thrive the way they want to thrive.
Yes. Oh gosh, I have so many questions. Let me just give you a roadmap of where I want to go. I would love if you can share anything you can from your work. It could be from any of the 4 work streams that can give us some hope, or anything that you think the audience would really love to hear. And then I would love to sort of end on what you're noticing about people who do thrive. And if there's trends or things that we can think of, um, just to leave us. So why don't we start with what you're learning and what people can sort of get excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's funny, we've all been using the term BD squared, and perhaps it'll be a part of the caption of the podcast, but we haven't defined it yet. So BD squared stands for Breakthrough Discoveries for Thriving with Bipolar Disorder. And it's very intentional that the word thriving is in there, because, to go back to Cara's point, the real goal of the work is to get to a place where every patient with this diagnosis has the ability to live their best lives, not just their depression symptoms remitted. We want people to be thriving, just like we all would like to, right? And so the BD squared has the 4 different components to it that Cara already described. The part I'm going to talk a little bit more about is the integrated network, which is, you referenced it, Morra, when you asked about the brain tissue. It is the sort of living component of the work that we're doing, where the plan overall is to integrate what is called a longitudinal cohort study. So this is a relatively standard research protocol that we're doing, where we're enrolling 4,000 people with a diagnosis of bipolar 1 disorder. The thing that's sort of unique about this work is, and the reason we call it an integrated network, is because that cohort study is embedded within what's called a learning health network. I'm going to put the idea of learning health network aside for a moment and let Mark talk a bit about that after I talk a little bit about what the cohort study actually looks like. So, as I mentioned, the plan is to enroll 4,000 people with a diagnosis of bipolar 1. And we will be following those individuals over at least 5 years of their lives. And so what this entails is the collection of information at what we call baseline. When participants come in, we ask them first, we go through the informed consent, which is very, very critical to any human subjects research, where we explain what they're getting themselves into and make sure that it's something they want to do, and give them the opportunity to ask any questions and to get questions answered. At that point, we bring them in and we do a remote interview to confirm a diagnosis of bipolar 1. That's the first step of the actual data collection. Once that single eligibility criterion is met, we then set them up at one of the local sites, which we'll talk about where they are and which are where they are across the country at the moment in a few minutes. But they go into that local site initially, and we collect a lot of data. We call this deep phenotyping. And I'll just make a sort of side note to acknowledge the importance of this particular deep phenotyping. When I talked a little bit about the genetics and what we know about the genes, what these genes do, are they impacting sleep? Is the variant increasing risk because it's changing someone's ability to regulate their emotions or some connectivity in the brain? We can't answer those questions in any study unless we do all of those measurements, unless we get brain scans, unless we get blood from those individuals, unless we do cognitive testing and really, really, really carefully map out the trajectory of that person's illness. So that's the importance of the deep phenotyping. Now, I'll tell you, it takes about 6 hours when a patient comes into the study on day 1. They are scanned. So we do an fMRI and an MRI brain scan. We do a few hours of neurocognitive testing, things like attention, memory, those types of aspects of thinking. We get blood. So we're doing collecting blood samples for a number of biological assays. And we then ask the participants to take home with them a Fitbit, so a wearable, where they will keep the Fitbit on them over the next year while we're measuring from them their activity levels, their sleep, and those types of measurements passively on their wrist. We're also in asking them to put an app on their phone where we're going to be intermittently, either biweekly or monthly, asking about stress levels, about depression, about mania, and importantly, about wellness. So really asking a lot of these questions on how are you doing in your life, not just how's your mood. Those measures are done in between these annual visits. So each year we bring them back into the local site to be phenotyped, or really look at these different measures and repeat those each year over a 5-year period. So I'll kind of pause there on the actual practical pieces, just to say a few things about the goal of the integrated network. There are key goals that require this level of deep phenotyping, and that are really, I think, just synergistic with what you'll hear Mark talk about with regard to what the learning health network component of this is. The first goal is really, we've talked a lot about heterogeneity. So it's really to say, let's characterize all of the possible ways a person expresses this disease, whether they ever have a depression. To your question earlier, Morra, there are few people that never do, that have a unipolar diagnosis of mania. They'll have a mania. There are many who show a course of worsening over time, or a kind of progressive looking course. Some people end up having cognitive impairment, some people do not. So the measurement of this over time is really important for us, just to map trajectories of what this illness looks like. We don't really know that yet in the field. The second goal is to then identify both behavioral and biological factors that contribute to differential course, right? So your question, an incredibly important one about what do people who thrive with this illness look like? We're painting that picture where we know we will have people who thrive over the course of this study, and we know we will have people who do not. And the identification of the things that make one person thrive and another person disabled allows us to start to think about how we treat and how we intervene to ensure that everyone can thrive. And so those behavioral and biological factors are some of the things I've already mentioned. Things like sleep quality, things like cognitive deficits, the measurements of things like stress hormones over the course of this is part of this. And really, again, thinking about these things as possible treatment targets and intervention points, so that the ultimate goal of the entire integrated network is really to inform better, more individualized care for everyone who is living with this illness.
Are you also looking at social determinants of health and the more sort of systemic layer as well on top of it?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll give you an example. One of the measurements that we're doing on the monthly basis using the app is the Everyday Discrimination Scale. So looking at stress related to discrimination in anyone's lives. And that could be because of things like race or socioeconomic status, but it may also, getting back to the stigma question, be just about having bipolar disorder and having that bipolar disorder diagnosis. There are a number of other components that we're picking up for social determinants of health as part of the Learning Health Network that Mark can comment a little bit more on. But we really are trying to take a snapshot of everything we can possibly get and think about, so that we can understand all of the things that contribute to these really complex outcomes. The last thing I think I'll say about this is those complex and important outcomes Cara mentioned. Many of those have been defined and selected by people who have lived experience with the disease. They were part of designing the study. They are part of the ongoing implementation of the study. We as clinicians and researchers care about different things than someone who has this diagnosis and is living with it. And so this is a really, really important component, and something we've really designed this work around.
That's very cool.
Morra, if I could give you one example of how, from a clinician point of view, partnering with individuals living with bipolar disorder has really shaped the design of our integrated network and learning health network. It's fundamentally a new landscape for clinicians and researchers in the field. So we've always design clinical trials or research questions thinking about pathology. Something's bad. How do we reduce pathology? How do we reduce symptoms? And if you look at every single clinical trial that's been done in bipolar disorder, it is about reducing or decreasing mania, reducing depression, reducing rapid cycling. A pretty strong voice came from individuals with lived experience saying, we don't think this way.
Yeah.
And if we're going to really see the Learning Health Network as collaborative, there has to be a different language. And as a clinician, I found this to be really an important journey for me to change my radar as to how I think about these things. And so if we were to do a deep dive into some of the scales and the instruments and the outcome measures we have for BD squared, it's not about reducing symptoms of depression. It is about increasing rates of wellness. It is about increasing rates of thriving. So we've taken every negative valence that we've been looking at and we've turned it upside down. And as opposed to focusing on reducing the negative, we want to increase the positive. And I think that fundamental shift will really be a welcoming gesture for individuals living with bipolar disorder to really partner in this collaborative event. And this gets to what Kate was referencing as part of our
Hold on,
learning.
can I just stop you for a sec?
Please. Yeah.
I don't know anybody who wouldn't want their depressive symptoms reduced. Just talk to me a little bit about that feedback.
So thank you for allowing me to clarify. Those are not going away. We still feel those are important to track for lots of different reasons. Probably most important to compare this science and this data that we'll generate to the field over the course of the last several decades and several decades to come. But we're adding measurements that are meaningful to individuals living with the illness as an add-on. So I think we're bringing there's something for everybody. Let's say it that way. Where in fact, I think clinical practice and research really was a very narrow, perhaps myopic for good reasons, but a relatively narrow way of looking at outcomes. And BD squared is really changing that rather dramatically.
Maybe to just jump on that, to say that it's simply not enough to have the absence of the negative symptoms, but that what we're looking for is that there is that, and that someone is able to live the whole life that they want to live. And what we've heard through the course of our work to date is that there's such a focus on reducing bad that people feel like they end up at best in a meh kind of place, and that's not what they're after.
I think that resonates. I mean, I think also just broadening it into the larger movement around neurodivergence, bipolar people mask, the ones who do thrive, who have typical jobs and live in society and conform to the norms. Bipolar people mask and camouflage a lot, and especially at work. And so I think there is this sense of, stop telling me to change who I am, understand who I am, but also make some of the horrible parts a little bit more easy to survive. Can I finish with a rapid fire couple questions? Now, as scientists, you're not going to like this, but I want you to just quickly answer yes, no, or we don't know yet to a couple questions that I'm going to ask. Is that okay?
Yeah.
We can try.
Okay. This is not a test. There are rumors in the community that I've heard that many bipolar people have higher intelligences or stronger cognitive abilities than others. Is that true or false?
I'll take this one. This is actually the area of my primary area of work, in fact.
Really?
Yes. And so the short answer is it's heterogeneous, right? So that's a kind of hand-waving, easy answer. And what we know about intelligence, let's start there very quickly. What we know about schizophrenia is that people who develop schizophrenia, if as early as you can measure it during childhood, will show lower levels of IQ than the general population. It's considered a risk factor for developing schizophrenia. This is not the case in bipolar disorder. What we see in bipolar disorder is particularly interesting, where we actually see, I'll just reference one particular study that I found maybe most fascinating. In people who were at the age of 18 prior to the onset of illness, who had IQ testing done, intellectual testing done, and then followed over time to see whether they developed a psychiatric illness. Those people who developed bipolar disorder, the risk factor for that from an intellectual standpoint was lower IQ, increased risk tenfold for a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, very similar to what I just described in schizophrenia, but also higher IQ, higher than average IQ, increased the risk for bipolar disorder by 13-fold. So it's bimodal. It's an interesting thing. So the heterogeneity is pronounced. It's not even just some general variation. There are risk factors of having very high IQ and a lower IQ with regard to bipolar disorder. Generally, and then I'll stop because I know we're coming close to time, but what we see in the cognitive profile of people with bipolar disorder after the onset of illness is also very heterogeneous. I'll go back to the idea that it does appear that some people will develop cognitive problems over the course of the disease. That seems to be associated with how recurrent the mania is of the illness. Something bad is happening to the brain during manias. And then some people will be resilient to that. And this study, BD squared, is really, really well positioned to try to understand what is it about those people who show that declining course from a cognitive standpoint that differs from the people who might also be having recurrent manias, but are stable from a cognitive standpoint. The important thing about this really is the fact that cognitive functioning is among the most important predictors of how a person is functioning in their lives. And so this comes back to this idea to thriving. People with cognitive impairment and, both subjectively and objectively will struggle with that.
Yeah. That is fascinating. I look forward to following this. Okay. Bipolar people often have anxiety disorders. True or false?
True.
So about 50% of people with a bipolar 1 disorder will have a comorbid anxiety disorder at some point in their life.
Bipolar people often have ADHD or ADHD-like symptoms.
True.
And especially misdiagnosed or first diagnosed in childhood.
Yes, right. So some of those cognitive deficits I referenced that are seen in a subgroup of participants with bipolar illness look like ADHD. So they may well receive an adult diagnosis of ADHD, and quite possibly at least some portion of those people are actually just experiencing cognitive impairment associated with bipolar disorder itself.
And when we see that comorbidity, this may be your third question, the rates of having an addiction go up tremendously. And so we see high rates of anxiety, attention deficit, addiction disorders. This, Morra, is really what speaks to that heterogeneity. And when you bring that other illness in, it changes how we think about treating both conditions. I think it really speaks to the complexity of what's in front of us, but the hope and optimism that BD squared with the setup that we have, with all the discovery mechanistic grants Cara was talking about, the deep phenotyping of the illness that Kate was talking about, and taking all of that and bringing it into a collaborative learning health network with participants living with the illness, their providers, statisticians, computational biologists, technologists. We're gonna make progress.
Can I ask you one more rapid fire question? This is a yes or no. There is some evidence that GLP-1s can be effective in managing bipolar disorder.
Yes.
Limited.
I would say these are very early days. It's a top priority for us as a network, and are starting to look at how we would design a study to convincingly guide us in that regard.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's a big open question.
I'm sure. Thank you all so much. That's it for this week's episode of The Anxious Achiever. If you love the show, please follow us and tell your friends. Write a review. It really helps us spread the word. Talk to you next week. I'm Morra Aarons-Mele.